You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 485 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering the latest letter from current and former employees of the OPCW disputing the organization's claims that Assad used chemical weapons. I have more updates on the coronavirus crackdown going on here in the US, and I'm going to talk about the Trump administration's latest attempt to destroy the Iran nuclear deal. All right, everybody, make sure you share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. Then I got an important one today, packed full of very good information. So if you could share it, I really appreciate it. At the Institute, you will also find the daily news roundup that I write in both the show and the news roundup are on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere, give it ratings, reviews, thumbs up, whatever you can. Help the show get noticed. And then if you want to give some financial support to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Try to update some audio equipment and stuff like that soon. If I get some financial contributions, obviously I get some nicer equipment, stuff like that, produce a higher quality show. All right, so first up on today's show is the coronavirus crackdown here at home. I do think it's important to talk about because just like a situation like in 9/11 where they declare emergency and they take all these rights, years and years later, we still have the USA Freedom Act. There's still mass spying on American citizens. The TSA still exists. So many of us have to get groped when we go through the lines at the airport, all in the name of safety. And so I think this is something that we'll have to continue to worry about and be vigilant of, especially actions like this one where undercover police officers arrested two women who are apparently running like a black market hair salon. So I suppose they were contacting people through Facebook. I'm not sure if they were having them to the physical establishment or to their own homes, but essentially they were running a hair salon either way. Now, good for these women for being industrious and helping out people who, for whatever reason, really feel like they need a haircut. Some people it's just a kind of self-care thing, long hair. You're really proud of your hair. It's the thing about you that makes you feel good, physical appearance and stuff like that. So especially at a time when people are so locked up, those kind of, even seemingly frivolous things to some could be very important to other people, getting those haircuts. Obviously, there's some people that have to continue to do their job. And so, maybe the McDonald's employees out there are all getting shaggy hair. That they want to trim it if they're out there serving food to us every day, and they want a nice clean haircut so they look decent at work. A lot of people care about how they look when they're out in public. That's something that should be able to happen, and isn't, because you have these two scumbag police officers busting these women who are doing nothing. We hear it time and again that domestic violence is up during the coronavirus lockdowns and quarantines as more people are pinned together at home. And rather than police focusing on actual violent crimes, they're focusing on two women trying to, keep their families together, make a little bit of money, and provide a much needed service to a lot of people. Also on the coronavirus lockdown, we have James Bovard's latest article over at the American Conservative, where Bovard explains that as people say, hey, it's been over a month and a half since Duncan Lubb's death, where it appears the police shot him either as he was in bed or sleeping through his bedroom window, attempting to serve a no-knock raid at 4:30 in the morning. As people look for those answers as to why the police did this, they're now saying that if people engage in protests, they could be arrested because, there's these state quarantines that, just like there's rules and regulations. I forgot to mention, I think those two women operating that hair salon face like 180 days in prison and thousands of dollars in fine. Now, hopefully nobody actually intends on enforcing something so strict, but those are the potential penalties of a Class B misdemeanor. And so here again, they're threatening thousands of dollars of fines and prison time, which is the most dangerous during the coronavirus outbreak, maybe other than a hospital emergency room. People are going to be unable to publicly demand the answers here in fear of being arrested and cracked down upon. So, this is where we see the abuse and, people who mock the people who are out protesting, saying like, hey, you can't take our First Amendment rights to assemble. Freedom of speech is important. This is why it's important, not necessarily for the Trump supporters who want to go out there and protest the coronavirus. Although, I do see their side of things, and I think it is important for them to be able to have their voices heard and get out there. And I do think they're making an important point. Whether or not, in the end, I think everybody should go back to work tomorrow or not, it is a different story. But just as far as understanding that a lot of people are suffering under this government mandated lockdown is appalling and has created a terrible situation for an awful lot of Americans. And so this is the kind of thing that police are going to crack down upon while, the media is able to kind of mock the people that are out there protesting, reopening the economy. That may be harder to do when it's a police involved shooting with, details so questionable and so little evidence brought forward already. Remember that this is a young 21-year-old man who was living at home with his parents who, they're probably still scared. He was sleeping in bed with his pregnant girlfriend, who I'm sure is also terrified. And they're not going to be able to demand answers at all and, face arrest if they try to protest. These are the things we need to be able to protest. As I'm going to talk about in the show, the U.S. trying to push Iran out of the nuclear deal, we should be able to and need to protest. And I think it's more likely that the government cracking down on protesters won't mean the people protesting and asking for opening up the country, but rather people protest the dirtiest deeds of the state, like manufacturing war and killing. So, I don't know if you could ever say good news in a coronavirus story, but an interesting note here, and it seems positive, that Navy investigators are recommending that Captain Brett Kozier, who was formerly the person in charge of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the nuclear-powered American aircraft carrier that was taken out of service by the coronavirus. And, a lot of people were, the captain was very concerned about the virus spreading on the ship, and would, some of his early pleas were ignored by his superiors, decided to write this letter, ends up getting him removed from captain of the ship. Well, so if he does get that post back, it would be a sign that sometimes in the military doing the right thing does, get you the justified response and reward. Facebook is suing an Israeli spyware company for spying on 1,400 accounts, including those of human rights activists and some journalists. I'm trying to follow this story and have more details on it as it came out. I know for a long time they were saying that, we can't even take up this case because it's an international actor, but they finally got a court to hear it. In some interesting Russiagate news, it appears that Christopher Steele had testified that he had met with the DNC, a couple of lawyers, and they had provided him with information making the claim that Trump was secretly communicating with Putin, or not maybe Trump himself, but the Trump team communicating secretly with, again, Russia, not necessarily Putin, in order to steal the 2016 election from Hillary Clinton. So apparently that information now was passed to Steele from the DNC, which should just, further go to show that the whole Trump dossier was absolutely bunk from the start and should have been thrown out, and just how terrible of a thing it is that, we've been led to this point because we recently had, I believe, the 75th anniversary of the day that U.S. and Soviet forces met along the Elbe River, which is significant, kind of a significant, like, geological time mark for the defeat of Nazi Germany by both, the U.S. And Allied forces, and then the Soviet forces coming in to destroy the Nazi state on either side. And that's something that should be celebrated. I guess Trump and Putin had like a call and a statement that said, oh, hey, we worked together in the past, we should work together in the future. And then, of course, you have the Russiagate critics jumping all over this, saying, oh, look how close Trump is getting to Putin, even though it's just these two guys having a conversation. And, as Scott Horton, the great Scott Horton show, says all the time, this is the most important relationship in the world, that between the U.S. and Russia is just constantly being undermined by all these people involved in the Russiagate conspiracy. Some update on Julian Assange is that his extradition case has now been postponed as the corona outbreak continues in the UK, a heavily hit country. And so, the judge there finally decided there was no way they could actually get this thing to happen middle of May. Who knows how long it's going to be before Julian Assange is again able to have whatever kind of sham trial he's going to have in the UK go on. A new report out says global defense spending in 2019 was $1.9 trillion, which is just an astounding number. But I hope this is something that just people look at and think about a little bit now as we're facing this coronavirus epidemic, and we spend all this money, to have conflict with other humans when, nature is still a real threat to us as a species. And it seems like spending such a massive amount of money to kill each other is completely unnecessary. And, to look to scale back some of this defense spending, either leaving money in the pockets of the people to go out and buy goods and services they actually need, not worthless F-35s and aircraft carriers. All right, moving on to Europe. French police said an attacker who wounded a couple policemen had a note in his car pledging his allegiance to the Islamic State. It's just important to remember that, France is a, former colonial power who had, a lot of different colonies in Africa and influence in the Middle East. That has since waned, but they remain militarily active in some of these areas. And so, blowback terrorism does come home to Europe and France, just like the United States. A report out says that Trump is looking to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan, with coronavirus making him want to accelerate that process. Hey, sounds like a good idea to me, Mr. President, but I'm guessing that you'll have to do one thing that you haven't been willing to do so far as president, which is really stand up for one of these foreign policy initiatives and tell the establishment, absolutely not. I'm going to do what I want this time. We're bringing the troops home. I'm not going to be conned into staying for the oil or securing the lithium mines or whatever the hell else excuse they're going to try to come up with to keep the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Maybe he'll just say, I'm done with it. I'm bringing people home. I have an election to win in November. In the first quarter of 2020, there were 500 Afghan civilians killed by the violence there. This is down significantly from 2019. So in that way, it's a good thing. I believe these numbers are the lowest that they have been since 2012. So a couple things. One is, obviously, if 500 civilians have died, the quote-unquote peace agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban didn't achieve peace, and that's been easily seen by all the fighting going on in the country in recent weeks. But at the same time, it does show that Afghan can be a more peaceful place, especially when the U.S. scales back military involvement. As in the prior years, we've seen a lot more deaths, even in this time, which isn't particularly high fighting season in Afghanistan. Have a lot of civilian casualties. The U.S. was carrying out more air. 2,500 paratroopers who were deployed to the Middle East around the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the former leader of the Iranian Quds Force in Iraq. After that happened, the U.S. deployed a whole bunch of forces, including these 2,500 paratroopers. They're now coming home. I wonder how much money the U.S. wasted deploying all these boys overseas, how much time was taken away from their families and everything like that unnecessarily for this needless escalation by killing Soleimani and then deploying more soldiers to the region where honestly they just become targets for the Iranians. I mean, if they would stay in the United States, they wouldn't be in harm's way whatsoever. So it seems that our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and I'm assuming somewhat with consent of the president, has hatched a new plan to destroy the Iran nuclear deal. So the U.S. left the Iran nuclear deal in May of 2018. This is the world we've lived in for nearly the past 2 years now. It has meant that the U.S. has increased its sanctions on Iran, which has prevented a lot of other countries, even who didn't impose sanctions on Iran, from doing business with them. It's devastated the Iranian economy and really hampered their ability to respond to the coronavirus. But now the U.S. says, well, we actually didn't leave the deal. We're just a participant in it, which is just some made up nonsense, right? Like, they're trying to have it both ways. And I brought this up in 2018 at the time. I said one of the problems with the U.S. leaving this deal is actually it may put the U.S. in a less strategic position diplomatically with Iran, because as a member of the deal, it was able to invoke the dispute resolution mechanism, and it would be unable to do that if it left the deal. Well, now they're trying to say, actually, we're just a participant to the deal, so we can still invoke the dispute resolution mechanism to try to get the United Nations and international sanctions reapplied to Iran. My guess is that this little scheme isn't going to work, and I don't think European countries will want to go along with it. But I do want to remind you, it wasn't that long ago that we had reports that the Trump administration was threatening stiff tariffs on some European products if they didn't invoke this dispute resolution mechanism to try to get more sanctions placed. And I think they're looking at extending some of the sunsets in the deal, saying that after so many years, Iran will be able to, buy weapons on the international market. If the U.S. is able, though, to get its European allies to go along with it, it seems possible then that Iran would just completely withdraw from the nuclear agreement. I'm not sure if they would also withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty, which is, the global basically nuclear deal to make sure there's inspections and that all countries aren't secretly developing nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure if Iran would go ahead and make nuclear weapons. The leadership of the country has been pretty disciplined in their position that that's not the steps that they're going to take to make nukes. However, further pushing Iran away from these nuclear agreements is only going to at least make it easier for the propagandists in the United States to push lies that Iran is making nuclear weapons, or push Iran into such a corner they feel like they have to make. In another Iran-Iraq story here, the U.S. says they are extending sanction waivers for Iraq to continue to import Iranian energy at least for another 30 days. In the past, these waivers have been given for, I believe, 120 or at least 90. So this is a much shorter waiver. I'm not sure how, with the price of oil dropping so low, what impact that's had on the accessibility for energy for Iraqis. Maybe it's a little bit cheaper, so they need less Iranian oil. But at the same time, it seems like in the midst of this coronavirus, would be a time where it's very important to keep that energy flowing in these contracts alive for people on both sides, as the Iranians probably need the revenue to finance some of the different equipment, medical equipment that they're trying to get around U.S. sanctions to import. So I want to talk a little bit in detail about this letter published at the Gray Zone with a editorial note from Mads Blumenthal and Aramate, and they describe the authors as current and former members of the OPCW, which is the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog Group that's supposed to go around the world and monitor chemical weapons use, make sure, like the IAEA does with like the Iran nuclear deal, the NPT, they're the enforcement mechanism for the, not enforcement, but maybe the surveillance, research, monitoring, monitoring is probably the best word, or should be, for these international groups that are supposed to just say like, hey, this country is or isn't abiding by the rules. So in this letter, the first thing the OPCW writers point out is, again, something I've talked about on the show a lot, the motivation for Assad to go ahead with these chemical weapons attacks seems like you would have to at least recognize that it's not a tactical advantage for Assad to use sarin in random rebel-held areas when he's already winning the war, knowing that using chemical weapons is going to bring him international condemnation. And for that reason, we can't just assume that Assad's a bad guy and likes to kill his own people, because Assad's very able to kill people with conventional weapons. Really, the only red line here is that he can't use chemical weapons to kill. And so if he just wanted to murder, it would also seem to be counterproductive to use chemical weapons, just because that is going to bring more scrutiny about him killing people at all. Most of whom, most of the Western media and the rest of the world don't particularly care about. The letter goes on to explain that there's a particular problem with this recent report from the OPCW blaming Iran for 3 chemical weapons attacks that occurred, I believe, in May of 2017 in rebel-held Syria, saying that sarin was used, and they produced some other evidence as well. Well, essentially, there was no fact-finding mission. There wasn't a group of OPCW employees who went on the ground to the site to, secure evidence and find out what happened. And all evidence came through the rebels and then, I believe, Turkish intermediaries. So, there's a lot of room here for evidence to be faked. The report goes on to point out that anybody could kind of create the evidence that was there, including they have some bomb fragments, but they don't have any larger pieces of bomb that would actually make it able to identify what the particular bombs are being used for. And so all this is very problematic for the OPCW report. The letter also talks about the larger problems in the OPCW and how the organization, and this is really easily seen throughout the Syrian civil war, has taken a more and more Western U.S. outlook on things and has adopted policies that has allowed the organization to produce reports that are below scientific standards and essentially look to frame a particular, belligerent in a conflict. In, this case, it's been Assad. So as more comes out on this, report, the whistleblowers themselves, again, this was interesting. It was current and former OPCW employees. I don't know if that would just mean it's the person who goes by the pseudonym Alex, who has been a whistleblower on, say, the Duma report, and Ian Henderson, who is the name of a former OPCW employee who conducted a test that really showed that the Duma attack was staged. Maybe it's just these guys, or maybe it's other employees going along with it. But it does seem like, there's a faction of people at the OPCW who understand the need for integrity of the organization, why it's important to make sure chemical weapons aren't used around the world, and want their group to remain independent and to do science, not propaganda for the U.S. All right, in some other Syrian news, Israel carried out several airstrikes near Damascus. I know the Syrian media reported that there are air defenses engaged. I didn't read of anything being shot down. It says that 4 international fighters, so they weren't Syrians, maybe Lebanese, Iraqi, Iranian, Russian, I'm not sure, and 3 civilians were killed in the attack. Turkish media is reporting that an oil tanker was targeted with explosives in Afrin. This is an area of Syria occupied by Turkey. It was, before it was occupied by Turkey, a Syrian Kurdish-held territory, and there's been reports of human rights abuses since the Turks took control of that area. They're blaming this bombing on the Syrian Kurds. They say 40 civilians at least and 11 children were killed in the attack. A little bit more news on Yemen here, where coronavirus is spreading and they're having a lot of trouble trying to figure out where it is coming from. There's just not enough test kits. There's not enough medical facilities. There's 2, 3, who knows how many different kind of areas are ruled by different groups of people. Information sharing isn't very clear. And, that's a recipe for this disease to spread a lot very quick and plague a country that is already essentially suffering from a plague in cholera. The U.S. has admitted to killing 2 civilians in Somalia in early 2019. The I guess story of the U.S. killing the civilians isn't particularly significant. I may have even, since I can't really find when the U.S. says this strike took place, I may have even talked about, local sources reporting this on the show or the airstrike happening. But, the problem is the U.S. reports the civilian deaths so long later after they happen, and they downplay them so much, or most of the time just never admit to them at all. Means that, that there's not enough information about what's going on in this war and the true toll of it. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you share the show. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor. I write the daily news roundup, both the show and the roundup found on the homepage. When you see the show somewhere online, make sure you like it, share it, whatever you could do to help the show get noticed. Things that have a lot of likes on Facebook to get seen by more people. Also, the way Facebook algorithms work, if you like my stuff, you're more likely to see it, and I think your friends are more likely to see it too. So make sure you do that. It really does help out the show. You could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. I'll be back with another show on Friday.